Hello, so in this tutorial, we are going to learn about triggers. Trigger, seen here, you've got a booster trigger and a bumper trigger. These are objects that apply a script, run a function, and do something interesting when something passes through them. They're kind of like a spatial button of sorts. Something goes through it in one direction or the other, and it fires an event. So let's break down triggers. And for the time being, I'm going to disactivate this. I'll take this node emitter and set it to false. And then what I'm going to do is come over here and do a blank piece of the space and draw a trigger for you. So you have, by default, a plane, a box, and a sphere as a trigger. So you can build a plane or a box. We did this on our slingshot, a sphere, and you'll notice that there's arrows on this plane. That basically indicates which side means which. I'll demonstrate that here really quickly. So on any of these triggers, if you want to see what this triggers, what function it runs and when it runs it, you can double click on the trigger and it'll open up this Lewis scripting window, or you can just come right up to the properties here and you'll actually see the events onEnter, onExit, onInteract, onLookAt. The primary ones you're going to be focused on are onExit and onEnter. And you'll notice as well that you can click here and get edit code on this triangle. You can also right click to get edit code. There's a lot of ways into that coding window. Again, double click, right click. I can double click it in the space. I can right click here and hit edit code. And there's other ways you can find, or you can find the ones, the events, these events that have functions related to them by noticing that their font is a little bit highlighted. The text is a little bit highlighted here, so it's a little lighter. So onEnter does have a function, but onExit does not. If you want to create an onExit function, you can click onExit. And that will, Simmetri is smart. It'll place that function next in the script, and then you'll write your function in here. Lua comments, hyphens. So what you have in a trigger is an onEnter or onExit function. So what does that mean? Well, here's an example. So basically, if this box is going to go and it goes into this cube, as soon as its midway point crosses that threshold, bing, it fires the onEnter. As soon as its midpoint crosses out of that threshold, bing, it fires the onExit. Likewise, on the plane entity, if I cross the halfway line in the direction of the lines, the enter is the direction going from lines to not lines. That's onEnter. So that's like the way into through a door or something. So onEnter, the way of the lines. onExit, the opposite way of the lines. And the sphere, that one's fairly obvious. And remember, it is the center point. So it can be a little bit, complicated in some cases to, you might think, oh, I want to, get the object as soon as it enters. So you need to sort of pay attention to the idea of what it might look like, or when you're going to actually get that center point. Make your triggers large enough or in the right places to kind of get the right behavior. Now, one other thing to pay attention to: there are things in the space that trigger that actually do activate a trigger, and things that don't. And you'll notice that right here under their properties that this cube is trigger activating. It has this attribute on it. There is you can remove that, and it will no longer activate that trigger. Some things, maybe if you're flying through this in VR, you don't want to have your body trigger the trigger. You might just only want objects that you bring through it to trigger it. Say, for example, you're trying to count something that's a goal. Oh, that's a goal that I scored a goal when this thing passed through. Well, you don't want to be able to score it with just your hand or flying through it. That would be cheating. So you need to make sure that there's trigger activating is off on your VR rig, and then on for things that are objects that you want to count and run the onEnter or onExit functions that you want. You can always re-add that trigger activating. So if I've got this cube and I say, oh, I actually do want this to activate the trigger, then you'll want to come to this top button here with the triangle on the top line of the object and click the plus trigger activating. So this is the attribute add menu here. And so we're going to add this trigger activating attribute. And so now you'll see this flash white. Boop. It's flashing white because this thing is trigger activating. And so one thing to pay attention to that'll tell you that this is working correctly even before we do anything is in playtime, if I'm selected on the trigger and I'm looking at its properties and I look at its events, if the events are expanded, and I'm seeing there's an onEnter code and it's bright, and I go in the onEnter direction, oops, I can actually simulate it here by moving the trigger. If you actually have to grab something, you'll end up taking your properties with it. But anyway, yeah, so you can see that when something enters it, it flashes pink. And there you go. And if I put an onExit code in here, I think even if there's nothing in there, I should see it fire when I go the other direction. There we go. As long as there's one in the, as long as there's something, this line through this line with anything, nothing, or, anything or nothing in between it, you'll see that fire. So yeah, so there you go. So that's the other thing to pay attention to is that when I go into like present mode or VR mode, I won't see the triggers. This is actually present mode. In fact, it's really interesting. If I turn this on, this node emitter, and I turn it back on to active, see in playtime I can see these triggers, but in present time, I just see the effect. And the idea is that you're not trying to have the triggers look like objects in your space. They are just kind of invisible agents. Force fields, if they're applying forces, I think you can kind of think of various metaphors. But you're going to say, oh, well, gosh, I want to actually see something in this space. I want to see the ball pass through some plane or give it some, give the representation of that threshold. I want to give that some visual. I'm going to show you two tricks to do that. The first is just put a plane on, draw a plane directly onto the trigger. Nice thing in Simmetri is that you'll draw things in the reference frame of the object you draw onto. So I just drew a plane, but remember a plane will, that plane entity is going to have a rigid body. And obviously if I make that immovable, now I can't pass through it. So I need to actually get rid of that, either deactivate that rigid body or remove it entirely. And what that'll do, either one, we'll go ahead and remove it. What that'll do is it now kind of gives me this this plane here that I can then kind of, like I was asking for, I kind of have this representation of the object. And this might even look more obvious on this one here. look more kind of interesting. Again, let's just remove that rigid body, and then here you go. So yeah, you could certainly see this stacking up pretty quickly. So that's some of the basics of triggers. In a later tutorial, let's go into more scripting and how you will build up interesting interactions. But that's sort of what to think about when you are thinking about using triggers.